introduce yourself.
I'm Rajiva Wijesinha, Member of Parliament and advisor on reconciliation to the President.
I would like to know a little more about the reconciliation. What is being done now after the war?
Well, we moved very quickly on what were the most obvious things. One is the rehabilitation of the former cadres and the resettlement of the people who had been displaced. And as you're probably aware of, the 300,000, almost all are now resettled. And of the cadres, there were about 11,000 odd. And government initially was wondering whether many of them would have to be charged. But after a year of rehabilitation being clear that the majority were really victims of the LTT, which had just conscripted them. So we've been doing a lot of work in both psychological as well as vocational training and healing. And they've been very positive. I mean, I've used some of my decentralized budget to do some work with them, including a course in counseling, because we felt that if we could use some of them to go back to their villages and work with people, it would be more effective. So that has now resulted in, I think, about 9,000 going back, and there are about 2,000 left, most of whom, barring about 500, should be released by the end of the year. But there are some under court orders. The other important factors that we've gone into are the building up of infrastructure and giving more economic opportunities, because a lot of the problems really arose from deprivation, which was, of course, perceived as discriminatory. But Sri Lanka had a major problem about unbalanced development. We had two Sinhalese youth insurrections, 71 and 89. And I think one very important fact of the present government is it's the first elected leader we've had who doesn't come from the Western province. I mean, I come from the Western province. I'd like to think I know my country. But obviously, if you've lived a life of relative privilege, you don't quite understand the real problems of rural sectors with regard to investment, education, transport, health. So we're trying to, as it were, fast forward the northern province now, as we did the eastern province.
Many people say, especially from the north and the east, that if there's no justice, there won't be real peace. What is done for doing justice?
Well, I think this country has much more justice than many countries that have been in conflict situations. I think justice is particularly important as something that people believe exists in any country, and it must be equal. But unfortunately, it is sometimes used as a word for retribution, and we're not into retribution. If we go around sort of finding out which of the LTT cadres we're now rehabilitating actually killed people, that we no point in rehabilitating them. Because in many cases, people in a conflict situation actually ended up doing things that perhaps they wouldn't have wanted to do. Now, in the case of our soldiers, who obviously had inflicted civilian casualties, but in our view, never deliberately, if we are told about specific instances, we would look into it. With regard to the LTT cadres, we know they did it deliberately. But, many of them were forced into it. So why should we engage in retribution? That's a very Old Testament concept. I think it's much more important to have restorative justice to make sure that people could move on.
I'm sure you have seen this Channel 4 movie with quite strong allegations, of war crimes. What is the stand of the government? Well,
the stand of the government is very, very clear in that it's made it absolutely obvious by looking at evidence that much of Channel 4 is completely false. For instance, Channel 4 began 2 years ago by showing a video of what they call executions. And we were able to show that the date they gave was wrong. They gave January 17th. They refused to give us the video. But using metadata, we showed that the date was July 17th. There was a supposedly dead man whose leg moved, and the excuse given was that he might have been drunk or sleeping. Now, that's a bit thick. But then there was a second version last year. They bring it out once a year in order to embarrass us. And the second version had 5 segments, which on analysis seemed to have been edited backward. I was surprised when I first saw it because bodies kept vanishing. And it turned out that segment 3 was segment 1. These were the UN reported. And apparently segment 5 was filmed at a different time, a different place. The longer film incorporates some of that. It incorporates shots on hospitals. It makes claims that are totally at variance with the truth, because I've been in close touch with the ICRC. And I've got information for them. I have it actually from them in writing about what they conveyed. And the Army gave me the material they had about when particular hospitals were given. And they only have the first 3 hospitals, which of course we spoke about. And of those first 3 hospitals, between January and early February, a total of 6 shells on 4 occasions fell into those hospitals, which I think is a pretty good record for any army, particularly because it's well testified that the LTT was firing from near there. I have, for instance, the letter from the UN guy. There was a UN group there, saying weapons have been brought in and are delivering fire to your forces from near the hospital. So I think in a context like that, of course it's a tough decision. You know, people are firing on you, do you fire back? I think the answer is you have to, but you have to take maximum care. And I think our 6 shells is better than any other army in the world. And that is ICRC. It's not what I'm telling you. I have all the documentation.
What about the UN report then, which was talking about war crimes from the LTT but also from the army?
Oh, it is an astonishingly shabby piece of work. Have you read it? It cites things that are false. For instance, it cites a press release of mine fraudulently, because it also claims a date for it that was not the date on which it was issued. You know, they say it was a response to something. I've answered all those. I'll give you a copy of the book that I've produced. I hope you read it carefully. But also there are things like, for instance, they talk about abusers in the camp, and then they give a little footnote. And the footnote actually is supposed to say how bad we were, but the footnote comes from a report about LTT camps. And I didn't find this. You know, I'd like to suggest that I'm a good researcher, and I found it. I didn't. It was one of the doctors who worked into the camp, and I think you've met him. And he was just furious because he said, you know, we did so much work, and they cannot actually cite their references. I mean, I don't know about you, but I come from an academic tradition where you check your references. And if your footnoting is not good, you don't use footnotes. And, you know, 3 professors getting it wrong. It's very shabby.
Now
the other thing is they make allegations without having checked. I mean, I checked with the head of UN OCHA. They haven't consulted the head of the UN here. In fact, they're very critical of him. But the head of the UN sent to us afterwards, you know, because of the efforts of government working with the UN, a humanitarian catastrophe was averted. Now, why don't they cite that? It's a bit nasty, don't you think?
Now there are 7,500 people which are still in Manic Farm. They should be shifted. I think Manic Farm should be closed by end of October. And
we're hoping to end it very soon. The problem is that some of the areas in Mullaitivu, which was the hardest hit, are very heavily demined. But in fact, I'm going up there next week to check. And apparently what we're trying to do is give them temporary accommodation in an area where they can start their normal lives again. Because I think it's particularly important that they should go back home. You know, what we had in the past, for instance, no one cared. You know, this is one of the saddest things, that for 20 years we had people in IDP camps and no one cared because they'd been chased out by the LTTE. And what happens to such people is a dependency syndrome develops. And I think one of the saddest parts of what I would almost call the refugee industry is the way people are kept in refugee centres. You know, Gaza is, to my mind, appalling. You know, how could people allow that? The Afghan refugees in Pakistan, many of whom didn't go back. And dependency develops. I'm afraid a lot of people make a lot of money. I mean, when the UN was doing this and they wanted to go on, not the senior UN people, but what they call consultants. I mean, we had a UN guy, temporary consultant, not one of the professionals, $11,000 a month. Now, people say that's money given by citizens in your country to help the poor people. It's not meant to allow Westerners to earn salaries that are 10 times what I earn.
But will these people finally be allowed to get back to the areas they come from, or will they just be relocated to some other
Well,
areas?
in almost all the cases now, they've gone back to the areas they're in.
The
last ones, it depends on if there is any area which is going to be used for security. But the present assumption is that, we had a former army commander who wanted to have big Israel-style cantonments. And government made it very clear it wasn't having that. And in fact, one of the reasons he resigned is he said, you ignored security by not letting me enlarge the army. Whereas the president had made it clear to him, I'm sorry, we don't need a large army, we've won the war. But we are going to have small military areas. We had a number of high security zones. That was a big problem because we had taken over houses, but most of them have been reduced to minimum.
There's still a part, especially where the last battle happened and where also some of these people come from, these IDPs who can't go back, which are still closed. Now, international deminers said that they could demine these areas within 4 to 6 months. The government says, no, it will take 1 to 2 years. What is this?
Well, which international deminers have told you this?
There are these
Well, one of the problems we face, and I'm really sorry to say this, but in May 2009, we said we cannot resettle people because we need to demine. And there were many people who said, oh, you're making that an excuse. And we said, no, we have to demine, and we really don't have the money, we don't have the equipment. And they said, no, you're making it an excuse. So in July 2009, and the reason I know this, I was Secretary of the Ministry at the time, we bought 25 machines, 25 flailing machines, which are very expensive. But we said we're going to do it. And after we did it, UNHCR donated us 5. But, the impression given to people like you is that UNHCR did the demining. We bought 25, and you know how much that costs. So then we did a rapid program, and we started the resettlement in September 2009. And the next thing I knew is some of the NGOs were telling me, aren't you demining too quickly? Aren't you resettling too quickly? Are you sure you've demined properly? I said, really, come off it. 6 months ago you told us we'll make it an excuse. Now we are doing it. And now you're telling us we're resettling too quickly. In actual fact, the record of our demining, which was mainly done by the army, look at the statistics of the areas demined, has been fantastic. Because I read a UNICEF report which talked about something, I can't remember, 27 casualties, and I really got worried. And I actually called up UNICEF and said, can I know where these happened? And there was only one incident, I think there's 2010, of a child in the areas we had demined suffering from an unexploded ordnance. It was a boy sent in to collect firewood, he didn't die. But the other deaths had happened in Jaffna, which had been demined by international staff. So if you give me something in writing, I would be happy to look at it. But I think there's a lot of gossip. And this type of gossip we found in 2009 was being spread by people who, A, wanted money. Because you have to remember this, I told you the shelter consultant of $11,000 a month. And when we did it, the Indian government helped tremendously. They actually sent 6 teams, which also helped us. But I think we didn't get enough help on the demining. I hope we get more now.
So you're saying it's mainly because of the mines that this last battleground?
There are 2 areas there. One, of course, is the area where the final battle took place, which is called Mullivaikkal. And I think even before we demine that, we would like to have closure on this whole business of, we kept people there wrongly. Once we start cleaning it, there'll be allegations that we cleaned up all the corpses, etc. People go there all the time. They weren't allowed in 2009. So I think before we start resettling people there, we actually need to clean out, which is going to be a slow process, all the effects of the LTT, etc., etc. For instance, the hospitals, there are still LTT weapons, no weapons, I'm sorry. Well, they're buried weapons, we know that, we're finding them, but uniforms and so on. So we hope that will be settled quite soon.
But nobody was allowed to go there, no, from the international community, as far as I know, to these last battlegrounds.
They've been going there recently, not immediately. Well, there were journalists at the beginning. Recently, people have been going all the time, as far as I know. You know that foreigners can go to the north freely now.
Still, there are some restricted areas, no? Like this last battle zone.
Not as far as I know. Well, it's a Sri Lankan, but he lives in England, and he asked me. And I actually said, is there any point going there? And they said, will you check? And I rang up the army.
Would you take us there then?
Sorry?
Would you take us there?
Well, to be quite honest, I don't want to be burdened with 2 young ladies. Right. But no, you asked for permission. As journalists, obviously. Don't forget we had this very embarrassing thing, and I feel slightly bad about it, because in 2009 March, some of us advocated for full access for journalists, and it was granted. And actually most journalists did very, very well. And in fact, as I said, the Indian journalists did a great job, because it actually managed to assuage people in Tamil Nadu, because they reported. But we had 2 or 3 who just lied. Channel 4 was one of them. And for some reason it started then. But the one I remember best was a journalist from The Guardian. The Guardian told me afterwards he wasn't a permanent journalist, he was a stringer, a man called Gethin Chamberlain. And he reported that 11 women had been found with their throats cut. And nothing of the sort had happened. I asked him afterwards, I said, why did you report this? And he had this lovely line. He said, my source was not reliable. I said, Gethin, are you going to correct your story? It's too late. I said, I'm sorry, but you say things like that which really are wicked. And you don't even apologize when you're wrong. And I'm sorry, but there are some people in defense who think all Western journalists are liars. I think we've had a good deal with the BBC, because they, although they're critical, have never actually told lies, And they are freely allowed. Charles Haviland, I don't know whether you know him. He's quite reasonable. But Channel 4 really created a mess for a lot of Western journalists. And one thing that really upsets me about what I call standards is that nobody in the Western world highlights that sort of lie. What I think people like you should also do as part of your investigative journalism is check on why people tell lies they know are lies.
You know what our problem is? I'm here now since Monday, and I called up each and every ministry, and I was not getting access. You're the first person, actually, I'm meeting from the government side. I wanted to talk to the army. I talked to Lakshman Hulagale. He closes the phone on me several times I think it's a very bad PR strategy,
I'm sure it's terrible, but you see the real problem. Take my own position. I'm always very open. 2 years ago, I said very clearly that there have been civilian casualties. You know what's immediately written? So-and-so admits there are civilian casualties, as though they've got it out of me. Last week I had interviews in India. Most Indian papers really reported it very well. Have a look. If you Google, there was a Hindu article, there was an article in the Times. But NDTV headlined it, Sri Lanka admits war crimes. Did you see that?
We heard about it, yeah.
And what really upset me is I wrote to the guy saying, could you just tell me what you said? Will you telecast a bit more of what I said? On their website, they had a little account, which one of the Sri Lankan papers picked up, but very decently, Sri Lankan paper asked me to respond. I responded. I sent it there. I said, put this on your website. Not a word. You have to realize, one of the Indian journalists told me, I was about to say this is wickedness. But one of the Indian journalists said, no, it's just ruthless competition. The more sensational you are, the worse. And I'm afraid you have to realize that, I love guys like you, but partly because, I'm used to your... Sorry? You're Swiss, who can't love you. But you have to remember that when you've been hit and hit and hit again by people who tell lies, then why the hell should we bother, if you'll excuse the language? And I'm afraid many of my colleagues are deeply hurt. I'm not sure that this... sometimes, of course, like today, one reason I called you back is the phone failed. And I thought, my God, I know these people. They'll tell people I put the phone down on them.
No, but...
You knew I didn't.
But you were really the only one. Anyway, let's...
Can I ask something or do you still want about the reconciliation?
About the military, I wanted to ask. The war is over, but there's still quite a large number of army up in the north and in the east. Why?
Well, there are two reasons for this. One is you have to remember that we're still very, very nervous. You have to remember that although the LTT in Sri Lanka is, as far as we know, over, there are people trying to revive it. One factor, I don't think this is true of Switzerland, but there are a couple of British and politicians, and maybe one or two in America, who are still very close to the former terrorists and collecting money. And, for instance, I've told the British Foreign Ministry, which tried to tell us, why don't you talk to something called the TGT? I said, really, if you tell us to talk to the Tamils in Sri Lanka and the elected representatives, that's a very reasonable thing to say. But do not ask us to talk to former terrorists and people who have not given up terrorism. So there is efforts to revive terrorism, and we are worried. Right. One, look at Iraq. When did the Iraq war end? I don't see hysteria in the West about the American forces in Iraq. These are double standards. Iraqis can't be trusted to look after themselves, but Sri Lankan areas that were traumatized.
I find it interesting.
Let me finish. Okay. Secondly, the army has actually done a very efficient job. I was just up when I went up last time. I actually said, why aren't they building houses in the Mullaitivu area? Because some of the areas were not good. Because when I went up immediately after the war, and please look at my website, the forces were building houses for people, single mothers, old ladies who didn't have anyone else. And I think that's necessary, and I've actually suggested they do a bit more of that. Because in the context in which some of the skills have gone, where there are single mothers, where there's no labour that can be offered free of charge, they have a role to play. Now that role has to continue until we have stability and normality back again.
And isn't there a danger if the army enters in these civilian fields? Also, they have luxury resorts, they're selling vegetables, that the whole society gets more militarized. Aren't there...
Come on, don't be silly. Really, you have to grow up a bit. There is an effort to say army can't do anything. At the same time, in many disaster situations in the world, armies are being trained to step in to do things. For instance, I was Secretary of the Ministry of Disaster Management as well as Human Rights. I was being asked to send army people to respond quickly because Switzerland, but no, you've got a large army despite your, peaceful history. It's conscripted. You're one of the few conscript armies left in the world. Yeah, I don't blame you. I don't accuse you of being militarized. But you have to remember armies can do a lot of work more quickly than others. And immediately after the war, cafes started run by the army. But if you go up to those areas, now there are lots of cafes run by non-army people. But, it fulfills the need. The army is not competing with them. For instance, when I was in Mullaitivu, I needed a drink. There was an army cafe. I stopped at the other one, partly because I wanted to talk to the people. Those are patronized. You have to remember that the army is not in Sri Lanka an evil word, although there have been people who have tried, especially, what I call the Bleeding Hearts International Community, that doesn't mind about militarization in Iraq or Afghanistan, who think that for some reason the Sri Lankan army is wicked. That is not the sense. When I spoke last time to people in the camp, the last few people left, they were describing to me how they came out and how the army had helped them. And one of the saddest parts of the Darusman report, it really is shocking. There's one claim about how the military was bribed to let people out of the camp. Now, we had allegations that the UN was being bribed, NGOs were being bribed. I'm sure individual soldiers were bribed. But when a wicked thing happens, it's the military. But there's this wonderful line.
This Greece man, no? The Greece devil.
We're not talking about the war. We'll come to that. We'll come back to that. But when the army helped people to come across, and there are thousands of instances of this, what does Darusman say? Individual members of the army. Food was delivered regularly. That medicines were delivered. ICRC delivered. No mention that all this was done by our forces. No one asked the ICRC about the letter they had sent, saying thank you for the work you did. And there's a lovely line from the ICRC head. We know that your sailors were only doing their duty, but they did it with a discipline and a kindness that is unusual. Now, the Darusman report doesn't talk about our disciplined sailors. It talks about who is disciplined in the views of Darusman. LTT. The only time the word disciplined appears there is with regard to the LTT. Something is wrong in this world, don't you think?
But if you are saying now that the army is playing a kind of a positive role and government has done a lot of reconstruction and resettlement, these elections were still assigned like the local elections that people don't trust. Your government was hoping with doing a lot of reconstruction they could maybe get more votes in the north, and it didn't happen. So what
Who told you it didn't happen?
TNA won with big majority, right?
No, just think of what the government got in the last election. You see, one of the real problems with you people is you don't actually study your briefs. There are two areas in which the election was held. Okay? Mm-hmm. Jaffna, which hadn't from the war, and the Vanni. Mm-hmm. In two of the three districts in the Vanni, have you read my article on this?
No.
The TNA, in one area, they got 48.5% or something. The government got 48. And the Muslim Congress, which is with the government, got 1.5. And as the President said rather sadly, if the Muslim Congress stood with us, we could have got a majority. Now, not only was that a very narrow margin, and in the other place they got over 40 as well. This is the Vanni, where the reconstruction is happening. It was enormous percentages higher than ever before. Yes, I don't know whether you know this, but in Sri Lanka, except in the first 10 years after independence, the North has almost entirely been represented by Tamil parties, outside the two major parties. This is the first time that you've had a major national party presence in the North. And to my mind, I thought 30% would be good. They got over 40 in the Vanni. But in Jaffna, they got roughly about 20. But 20 is still better than 10. So you don't look at, it's a bit like, when people talk of, the Greens doing badly, they only got 5%. Okay? If they got 1% the time before, 5 is a very good result. But part of the problem is, journalists like you come from outside. You don't study psephology. You don't actually study what actually had happened in the previous election. Okay? Right. Any more questions?
Please, one more question, yeah. Okay. The Greasyaka.
Yeah. Well, the Greasyaka consists of three different phenomena. I was actually talking to a Sri Lankan friend about it. Call me in 10 minutes. One phenomenon was the actual existence of Greece people doing robbery. And apparently the story began because in one or two places people, took off their clothes, dropped grease on their bodies, went to houses and started to steal. But the real problem in that type of phenomenon is it actually leads to things like sexual perversion. If you're running around without any clothes on and ladies get up in the middle of the night, you start behaving extremely badly. And I'm afraid that happens. Now, the allegation is that a couple of these Greasyakas came from within the army and the police. But the evidence for that is very thin. It could have happened. I'm not for a moment saying there aren't nutcases in any institution. I don't know whether you saw this, it was quoted in Parliament yesterday. Did you read about the Americans who cut off fingers in Afghanistan?
No, I didn't read it.
This is the whole problem with you guys.
No, I was in Putnam. I was researching.
Well, I'm in Colombo, but I bother to read.
I came back at 12 o'clock in the night. I'm excused. Okay.
No, you're not. This actually happened 2 months ago.
I was in Africa and I was there.
No, part of the problem, I'm afraid, is that what you people don't really understand is there is a mindset that says an individual aberration. I told you the Drausman report said that. An individual aberration by a coloured person means that all of them are horrid. An individual aberration by a white person means, oh my God, but we'll stop it because we are civilized. For instance...
But this Greasyaka again.
I've told you, it's perfectly possible in one or two instances someone came from a camp and went back into it. But if you look at the incident in Jaffna, and I will say that what happened afterwards was certainly wrong because people went to that village. But, the TNA have actually told me what happened is the people who were upset got emotional and went and started stoning the camp. Now, reacting to that in a bad fashion is wrong. And if in the night people from that camp went and attacked those people, that is absolutely wrong. But it's also wrong to stone a camp. One of the big problems is hysteria was being whipped up. My Labour Party people.
There's still quite a bit of fear in society, no? That something like a psychosis can happen.
You call it fear when a group get together and go and stone an army camp? 2 years ago, that would never have happened. Let me be quite honest. 2 years ago, when the army was absolutely frightened that terrorists would come in and would have reacted very sharply, people had gone to stone an army.
Then we call it anger, even worse. Then we call it anger.
No, you must choose your words carefully. If you're telling me people are angry, you're right. But if you're telling me that people are frightened, you're wrong. Don't you think that people expressing anger openly suggests there's no fear? You have to get your words precise.
No, but I would say there's both. I've been in Putlam. I've met people who were completely terrified. I've met people who were completely angry. So I've met both, and I think they are both in that case.
You've met people in Sri Lanka who are completely angry with you, but I don't say you're a wicked person. You've met people in Sri Lanka who don't want to talk to you. You and I would like to suggest that these people, if they actually bothered to talk to you and find the truth, would find you a wonderfully civilized, decent person. But people get angry irrationally. You and I happen to be rational people who, if someone says something we don't like, think, let's talk to them. But most people in this world are not like that. I think a lot of feeling was whipped up. The amount of twittering that went on this occasion. And, unfortunately, social media tends to be something that creates hysteria rather than anything else. Events have happened, but it's all died down now. If you go to Jaffna, according to people, I've checked on it. The feelings are much less now. It is important, and this is correct, that when feelings are roused, you must actually do your best to bend over backwards to be nice.
What does the government do now? Because there was yesterday, there was a meeting, quite high-level meeting, because of that Greasyaka.
No, the government met the TNA members of Parliament, who are the representatives of the people, and discussed it. I'm told the meeting went very well. You have to remember that there are some people in this world, and I will exempt both of you from this for the moment, who want trouble. Because, unfortunately, in this modern world, for a journalist, the more chaos there is, the better. Unfortunately, you guys don't go and report on 5 American soldiers who went round Afghanistan cutting the fingers of little boys. No, that's not important, because it's Afghans who die, and it's committed by people whom you're not going to criticize. Okay? Now we'd better run.